The letter was already waiting for him on the bar when Jacob Calloway pushed through the saloon doors of Dusty Creek, Nevada, in the autumn of 1882. He had not even told anyone his name. He had not told anyone which direction he was riding from, or what brought him to this particular town on this particular Tuesday afternoon, when the October wind cut down Main Street like a blade looking for something soft to ruin. He had simply mailed one letter 3 weeks prior to the post office of a town he had never visited, addressed to a woman he had never met, and now here he was, trail dust still rising off his shoulders like smoke off a cooling pistol, and the barkeep was sliding a sealed envelope across the scarred oak surface before Jacob had even ordered a drink. "You Calloway?" the barkeep asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Jacob's hand hovered over the envelope. His jaw tightened. The saloon behind him was loud with afternoon drinkers, but in this small radius of space, everything felt unnaturally still, as if the world had decided to hold its breath along with him. "How long has that been sitting there?" Jacob asked. 3 days, the barkeep said. "Woman from over on Sycamore Lane brought it in herself, said to give it to a man named Calloway when he rode in, said she would know before he arrived." The barkeep shrugged like the whole thing was ordinary. "I figured she was touched in the head, but then you walked in looking exactly like a man named Calloway." Jacob picked up the envelope. His name was written on it in a precise, unhurried hand, the letters formed with the kind of deliberate care that told you the person writing them had chosen every stroke with intention. There was no wasted flourish, no trembling uncertainty. Just his name, written like it was already inevitable. He turned the envelope over. It was sealed with a small pressed wildflower, the wax the color of dried amber. Something cold and sharp moved through him that had nothing to do with the October air. He had spent 11 years drifting. 11 years of one town bleeding into the next, of faces that never remembered him past the next morning, of secrets he carried like stones in his coat pockets, adding weight with every mile. He had written that letter on a desperate night in a Reno boarding house, because a man he trusted with his life had told him about a woman in Dusty Creek named Alice Merritt who was smart, honest, and in serious trouble, and who might need the kind of help that only someone with Jacob's particular and carefully hidden set of skills could provide. He had written the letter as a practical matter, a professional communication. He had not expected her to write back. He had not expected her to know he was coming before he arrived. And yet here was the evidence of something he could not explain, pressed flat against his palm, sealed in amber wax, already 3 days old. He ordered a whiskey, sat down at the nearest empty table, and opened the letter. The handwriting inside matched the envelope, that same steady, unhurried precision, and what she had written stopped him somewhere between the second and third lines so completely that he set down his whiskey glass without drinking from it. She wrote, "Mr. Calloway, I do not know you, and I have some reason to believe you do not know everything about why you are coming here, which means we are both operating with incomplete information and should perhaps begin by being honest with one another rather than pretending to strategic advantages neither of us actually possesses. I know who sent you. I know what he told you. I know that what he told you is only part of the truth. The rest of it is the part that gets people killed." Jacob read that paragraph 3 times. Then he read the rest. By the time he folded the letter and placed it inside his coat pocket, pressed against his ribs where he could feel the crinkle of the paper with every breath, the whiskey was still untouched, and the afternoon light through the saloon windows had shifted from gold to copper. He sat for a long moment in the kind of stillness that arrives when a man realizes that whatever he thought he was walking into, the actual situation is considerably more complicated and considerably more dangerous, and also, somehow, considerably more interesting. He asked the barkeep for directions to Sycamore Lane. To understand how Jacob Calloway had come to be sitting in that saloon with a letter pressed against his heart, you had to go back 3 weeks to a smoky corner table in a Reno establishment considerably less respectable than the one he now occupied. He had been finishing a job, which in Jacob's vocabulary meant he had successfully located a man who had stolen a considerable amount of money from a Nevada mining consortium, and had persuaded that man, through a combination of persistence, psychological pressure, and the kind of calm, focused negotiation that had made Jacob's reputation in certain quiet circles, to return what he had taken and leave the territory. No shooting. Jacob had not fired a weapon in 6 years, a fact he was quietly proud of even though the reputation that kept him employed was largely built on the assumption that he could and would. The man who sat down across from him after the job was finished was named Roy Garrett, and Jacob had trusted Roy Garrett for going on 8 years, ever since Roy had pulled him out of a bad situation in Laramie that Jacob did not particularly like to think about. Roy was the kind of man who always seemed to know things a little before other people knew them, and who had a gift for showing up at exactly the right moment, and who had a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in whatever room you were sharing with him. Roy told him about Dusty Creek. He told Jacob about a woman named Alice Merritt who ran a small lending library out of the front room of her house on Sycamore Lane, who was the daughter of the late Judge Merritt, who had died 6 months prior under circumstances that Roy described as not entirely natural. He told Jacob that Alice was sitting on something valuable, a document, possibly more than one document, that certain parties in Dusty Creek would very much like to see disappear. He told Jacob that she needed someone who could navigate a complicated situation without turning it into a bloodbath, someone smart and discreet who could figure out the shape of the problem before the problem figured out the shape of them. He told Jacob the pay would be generous. What Roy did not tell Jacob, as Alice Merritt had written in her letter, was the rest of the truth. Jacob would learn the rest of it in pieces, the way you learn anything real slowly, through the accumulation of small details that only make sense when you hold them up to the right light. He found the house on Sycamore Lane in the long copper afternoon, with the wind carrying the smell of pine resin from the hills above town. It was a modest house, not poor but not wealthy, painted a blue that had weathered to something between gray and green, with a front window through which he could see the neat spines of books arranged on several shelves. There was a vegetable garden to the side that had been recently turned over for winter, the soil dark and recently worked. A calico cat sat on the porch railing and watched him approach with the particular expression of a cat who has decided you are probably not worth the energy it would take to be alarmed. He knocked. There was a pause of perhaps 30 seconds, during which he had the distinct impression of being assessed through some means he could not identify, and then the door opened. Alice Merritt was 26 years old, with dark hair pinned up in a way that suggested it would be considerable if released, and brown eyes that were doing several things at once in a way Jacob found immediately compelling. She was assessing him, obviously, but she was also, he sensed, running through a series of internal calculations with a speed and precision that reminded him of the best card players he had ever encountered, the ones who seemed relaxed because they had already processed all the relevant information and were now simply waiting for the outcome they had predicted. She was wearing a plain dark dress with white collar, practical and clean, and she had ink on her right index finger, a small detail that for some reason lodged in his chest like a burr. "Mr. Calloway," she said, not a question, a confirmation. "Miss Merritt," he said, "I got your letter." "I expected you might have questions," she said, stepping back from the door in a gesture of invitation. "Come in." The front room was the lending library, small but well organized, with perhaps 200 volumes on shelves that covered 2 walls completely and were starting to colonize a third. There was a writing desk near the window with a lamp, and an inkwell and a stack of papers that she had clearly just turned face down when she heard him knock. There were 2 chairs arranged near a small stove that held a fire against the October chill, and a table between them with a ceramic teapot and 2 cups, which told him she had been expecting him today specifically. "You knew I was coming today," he said, sitting in the offered chair. "I made a reasonable estimate," she said, settling into the opposite chair with a composure that struck him as remarkable for someone who was, by her own letter's admission, in a situation that got people killed. "You sent your letter from Reno on the 14th. The fastest mail route to Dusty Creek typically runs about 10 days, adding time for you to settle your previous matter in Reno, which I estimated would take another few days based on what Roy told me about it, and then riding time from Reno, which is roughly 3 days at a reasonable pace. I arrived at today, plus or minus 1 day." She poured him tea without asking if he wanted it. "I made tea both yesterday and today just in case." Jacob Calloway, who was not easily surprised, found himself looking at this woman with something that was not quite any emotion he had a ready name for. "Your letter said Roy didn't tell me everything," he said. "He did not." She held her own teacup with both hands, not for warmth, he thought, but for something to hold. It was the first sign of tension he had noticed in her, that small bilateral grip. "Roy Garrett is my father's former deputy. He was also, for a period of approximately 5 years ending 3 years ago, skimming funds from the county treasury in an arrangement my father discovered and chose to handle quietly rather than publicly, out of loyalty to a man he had known for 20 years. She met his eyes steadily. "My father's death 6 months ago was not from natural causes, Mr. Calloway. He was poisoned. Slowly. Over the course of several weeks. And when I began investigating it, I found documents in his office that Roy Garrett very much does not want anyone to see." The room felt smaller suddenly, the fire crackling with inappropriate cheerfulness. "Roy sent me here," Jacob said slowly, working through it. "Which means Roy sent me here either to help you or to get close to those documents." "That is the question I have been sitting with for 3 weeks," she said. "Since I posted my letter to you before I knew quite enough. I wanted to be honest with you from the first moment you arrived rather than let you walk into this situation without the full picture. It seemed, frankly, like the only fair thing to do." "You could have not answered," Jacob said. "You could have been gone when I arrived, changed your name, left town." Something moved through her expression, brief and complicated like a cloud crossing a clear sky. "This was my father's house," she said, "and my father was murdered. I am not leaving." In the silence that followed, the October wind pressed against the window glass with a soft, persistent sound, and the fire shifted and settled, and Jacob Calloway felt something he had not felt in a very long time, something that was either the beginning of a decision or the beginning of something considerably more treacherous to his long-practiced emotional detachment. He felt, with a certainty he could not logically justify, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He stayed in Dusty Creek's only boarding house that first night and slept poorly, not from any external threat but from the activity inside his own head, which had apparently decided that now was an excellent time to examine every assumption he had made about the last 3 weeks from a new and more complicated angle. Roy Garrett had trusted Jacob with dozens of jobs over 8 years. Jacob had trusted Roy in return. That trust was now a thing with a suspicious crack running through it, and examining the crack was like pressing on a sore tooth, simultaneously necessary and unpleasant. In the morning he had breakfast at the town's small restaurant, which was run by a woman named Mrs. Dupree, who made extraordinarily good biscuits and had the manner of a person who noticed everything and said only a carefully curated fraction of what she knew. He asked Mrs. Dupree in a conversational way about the late Judge Merritt, and Mrs. Dupree's hand stilled very briefly on the coffee pot before resuming their motion. "Good man," she said. "Fair judge. People respected him." "And his death," Jacob said. Mrs. Dupree looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had been living in a small town long enough to understand that certain questions were dangerous. "Doctor said it was his heart," she said. "But Dr. Holloway has been working for the county commissioners for going on 12 years now, and the county commissioners were appointed by the previous circuit court judge, who was appointed by men who did not particularly care for Judge Merritt's rulings on land claims." She refilled his coffee cup. "I did not say any of that, and you did not hear it." Jacob spent the morning walking the town slowly, the way he had learned to walk any new territory, with the kind of deliberate, observational calm that looked like aimlessness, but was anything but. Dusty Creek was a town of perhaps 400 people, with the businesses and social hierarchies typical of a Nevada settlement of its size and era. There was a general store, a bank, a barbershop, a blacksmith, 2 saloons, a church, and a small schoolhouse. There was also, Jacob noted, a land office that seemed disproportionately busy for a town of this size, with men coming and going in ones and twos throughout the morning, men who wore the kind of clean, expensive clothes that suggested they were not actually working the land they were filing claims on. He filed this observation away and returned to Sycamore Lane in the early afternoon. Alice was in the garden, which surprised him, turning the soil again with a fork even though she had clearly done it recently. When he came through the gate, she looked up, and he saw immediately that something had shifted since the previous afternoon. She was still composed, but it was a tighter, more deliberate composure, the kind that was working harder than it looked. "Someone was in the house last night," she said without preamble. Jacob went still. "You are certain?" "I placed a small thread across the inside of my study door before I retired," she said. "It was broken this morning. Nothing was taken that I can identify. But I keep my father's documents in a locked box under the floorboard beneath the writing desk, and someone disturbed the rug." She thrust the garden fork into the soil with a controlled force that communicated what she was not saying out loud. "They did not find it. The rug was replaced, but not precisely correctly." "They will come back," Jacob said. "Yes," she said. "I know." She looked at him with those calculating, layered eyes. "Which returns me to my original question about you, Mr. Calloway. You were sent here by a man who may be connected to the people who searched my house last night. You have a reputation for being effective and discreet, and for not shooting people unnecessarily, which is either excellent or irrelevant depending on the nature of what we're actually dealing with. And you are, by all visible measures, a drifter with no particular stake in my town or my problem." She pulled the garden fork free and planted it upright in the soil. "Why should I trust you?" It was, Jacob thought, the most reasonable question anyone had ever asked him. He told her the truth, which was something he gave out carefully and infrequently, like a man who has learned that honesty is a currency with limited supply and should not be spent carelessly. He told her that he had spent 11 years doing the kind of work that kept him from putting down roots, partly for practical reasons, and partly because putting down roots required a kind of faith in permanence that his life had consistently punished him for having. He told her that Roy Garrett was one of perhaps 3 people he had trusted in those 11 years, and that her letter had cracked that trust in a way that made him angry, and that anger had a clarifying effect on his judgment. He told her that he had no connection to the county commissioners or the land office or whoever was systematically stripping the legal protections from the land claims of Dusty Creek's smaller settlers, which was what he suspected the documents in her father's locked box were about. And then he said, with a straightforwardness that surprised even himself, "I also think your father deserved better than what happened to him, and so do you, and that seems like sufficient reason to stay." Alice Merritt looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "The documents," she said finally, "are records of a scheme my father spent the last 2 years of his life building a case against. A man named Caldwell, one of the county commissioners, has been systematically filing fraudulent mineral claims on land belonging to settlers throughout this valley, using a combination of forged survey documents and pressure on the local courts. My father was gathering evidence to bring to the territorial governor. Before he could, he was poisoned." She paused. "Roy Garrett's name appears in those documents as an intermediary. He was not the architect of the scheme, but he facilitated it, and he knew what happened to my father, and he sent you here to find those documents and destroy them." The afternoon sun moved behind a cloud. The garden went briefly gray and cold. "Or," Jacob said carefully, Roy sent me here because he is trying to find a way out and he knows I can navigate this without it exploding into something that destroys everyone including him. Alice's eyes narrowed fractionally. You are more generous toward him than I am. I am trying to understand the full shape of the problem before I act on it, Jacob said. There is a difference between a man who facilitated a crime because he was afraid or in debt or compromised, and a man who actively chose to murder a judge. That difference matters. She studied him with an expression he could not fully read, which was unusual for him. You think like a lawyer, she said. I think like a man who has spent 11 years cleaning up situations that went wrong because someone acted on incomplete information, he said. It does not always work out, but it works out more often than the alternative. The cloud passed. The sun returned, catching the dark of her hair, and Jacob looked away toward the hills above town with a deliberateness that had everything to do with the fact that he was finding it unexpectedly difficult to think clearly when he was looking at her directly. Over the following days, a rhythm established itself between them that Jacob could not have predicted and did not quite know how to categorize. He came to the house on Sycamore Lane each morning, ostensibly to plan their approach to the problem of the documents and what to do with them. But in practice, they spent as much time in conversation that wandered considerably further than the immediate situation as they did in focused planning. Alice was extraordinarily well-read, a natural consequence of running a lending library, and she had a mind that moved between subjects with an agility and humor that Jacob found increasingly, dangerously enjoyable. She would be analyzing the legal implications of her father's evidence one moment, and then, in the next breath, express a sharp, dry opinion on the relative merits of two competing theories she had read about in a scientific journal a patron had left behind, and then be back to the legal question before he had fully finished responding to the scientific one. He brought her information from his observations around town. She integrated it with the information she had been quietly gathering for months, and the picture that emerged was both clearer and more alarming than either of them had had alone. Commissioner Caldwell, it turned out, was not acting independently. He had backing from a San Francisco investment concern that was positioned to profit enormously from the mineral claims once they were consolidated and properly worked. The scheme was not local opportunism. It was organized fraud with significant capital behind it, which meant the people defending it had both the resources and the motivation to be extremely unpleasant about anyone who threatened to expose it. Roy Garrett was, as Jacob had suspected, a man caught between what he had done and what he knew to be right, and Jacob had been right that there was a difference between him and Caldwell. What Jacob had not anticipated was the message that arrived at his boarding house on the fourth day, a note in Roy's handwriting, brief and urgent, that said only, "Caldwell knows she has the documents. He is sending men. Get her out." Jacob read the note twice, folded it, and went directly to Sycamore Lane at a pace that was not quite running but was adjacent to it. He found Alice at her writing desk, which was where she spent most mornings, with a pen in her hand and an expression of focused calm that he was beginning to understand was her natural state under pressure. When he came through the door without knocking, which he had never done before, she looked up and read his expression in approximately 2 seconds. "What has happened?" she said. He told her about Roy's note. She set down her pen with great care. The calm did not crack exactly, but it reorganized itself into something more operational. "How long do we have?" she said. "Roy did not specify," Jacob said, "which means we should assume not long." "The documents cannot leave the house without being photographed," she said. "They are the only evidence. If we take them and are intercepted, everything my father worked for disappears with us." "Then we don't take the originals," Jacob said. "Is there a photographer in town?" She was already standing, moving to the locked box beneath the writing desk with the practical efficiency of someone who had mentally rehearsed this moment. "Tom Wicker has a studio on 2nd Street. He does portraits mostly, but he has the equipment for document photography. I have spoken with him. He knows who I am and what my father was trying to do." She came up with the documents, a stack of papers in a cloth-wrapped bundle that she held against her chest for a moment with both hands, and the gesture was so human and unguarded that something in Jacob's chest tightened around it. "Copies to Wicker's studio, copies sealed and addressed to the territorial governor in Carson City, and originals back in their box," he said. "Yes," she said. "And then we need someone to carry the copies to Carson City today before Caldwell's men arrive." They looked at each other for a half-second in which a great deal of silent negotiation occurred. "I will go to Wicker's studio with you," Jacob said. "The fastest rider in this town is not me, because if I leave and Caldwell's men arrive, there is no one here who knows the full situation well enough to handle it." He paused. "Who do you trust in this town?" Alice thought for exactly 4 seconds. "Eli Boone," she said. "He rides dispatch for the mining company 2 valleys over. He is 17 years old and his father was one of the settlers whose land Caldwell took. He hates these men with a perfectly calibrated adolescent fury, and he rides faster than anyone in this county. He is also honest to a fault." Jacob noted that she had said 17. He said, "I will need someone who can also carry authority. Someone Eli can back up with testimony if needed." Alice nodded. "Mrs. Dupree. She has been collecting her own documentation for 2 years. She knows the territorial governor's office personally. Her late husband was a territorial senator. She can send official correspondence that will not be ignored." In the space of 40 minutes, which was the kind of efficient, coordinated action that Jacob associated with people who were operating under genuine threat, and had stopped wasting energy on panic, they had photographed 12 pages of her father's documents at Tom Wicker's studio while Tom himself, a quiet, mild-mannered man with round glasses and ink-stained fingers much like Alice's own, worked with focused speed and asked no unnecessary questions. 2 sets of copies were sealed and addressed, one to the territorial governor and one to the federal circuit court. Mrs. Dupree, when they arrived at her restaurant door with the copies and the situation explained in clear, rapid terms, did not hesitate for a moment. She sent word to Eli Boone, who arrived within 15 minutes on a paint horse that was already saddled, and who took the letters with the gravity of someone who understood exactly what they represented and what they might cost him. Jacob watched Eli Boone ride out of Dusty Creek at a full gallop toward the Carson City road, the late afternoon sun turning the dust he raised into a brief, bright cloud, and then he turned back to Alice, who was watching the same thing. "Now we wait," she said. "Now we wait," he agreed. They returned to the house on Sycamore Lane, and Alice rebuilt the fire because the afternoon was cooling rapidly, and because Jacob suspected she needed something to do with her hands. He sat in the chair across from hers, and they did not speak for a while, and the silence was surprisingly comfortable, the kind of silence that only happens between people who have moved past the performance of ease and arrived at the actual thing. "Tell me about the drifting," she said eventually. He looked at her. "You have been doing it for 11 years, she said. "That is a long time to keep moving. There must be something at the beginning of it." He was quiet for a moment, considering what he was willing to say. "Laramie," he said finally. "1871. I had a job there, permanent work, thought I was going to stay. I was 23. He paused, watching the fire. "There was a situation that went wrong. People I was responsible for got hurt because of choices I made that I thought were right and turned out to be costly. I left and I told myself I was leaving because staying was pointless, but the truth was I was leaving because staying meant living inside what I had done, and I was not ready for that." "And in 11 years you never found anywhere that made you ready?" she asked. The question was simple and direct, and sat somewhere in the middle of his chest with quiet, considerable weight. "No," he said. "Not until approximately 4 days ago." The fire crackled. Alice Merritt looked at him for a long moment and then looked at the fire herself, and the expression on her face was something he had not seen there before, something younger and less guarded and considerably more frightening to him than anything else about the current situation. He realized with a clarity that was both welcome and alarming, falling in love with this woman. He was doing it quickly and helplessly, and in the middle of a situation that was actively dangerous, and it was possibly the most sensible thing he had done in 11 years. Caldwell's men arrived the following morning. There were 3 of them, which was more than Jacob had hoped for and fewer than he had feared, and they came openly, as if the intimidation of visible confidence was its own message. They were not outlaws in the traditional sense of the word. They were the other kind of problem, men with legal employment and legal authority borrowed from the weight of money, who understood that the threat of official interference was often more effective than actual violence. They came to the house on Sycamore Lane at 10 in the morning, with a piece of paper that one of them described as a county commissioner's order to search the premises. Jacob was there when they knocked, because he had been there since before dawn, because Roy Garrett's note had not specified a time, and Jacob had long ago learned that the only safe assumption about when trouble arrived was always earlier than you expected. Alice answered the door with a composure so complete that it bordered on magnificent. She read the paper they presented with the careful attention of someone who has handled legal documents all her life and knows exactly what to look for and where the edges of authority lie. "This order," she said, "is signed by Commissioner Caldwell. Commissioner Caldwell is named in a formal complaint regarding fraudulent land claims that has been filed with the Territorial Governor's office as of this morning." She paused. "A document bearing his signature authorizing a search of property owned by the daughter of the judge who was investigating him for fraud is not a legal instrument. It is evidence." The man in front, who had the look of someone accustomed to his authority not being questioned by women in blue-gray dresses, said, "Ma'am, this is not something you want to complicate." "I have already complicated it considerably," Alice said pleasantly. "Gentlemen, you are standing on private property with a fraudulent document, in a town where your employer is about to face a territorial investigation. I would suggest that your own interests might be better served by reconsidering your current employment, rather than continuing this particular errand." Jacob was standing to the side, visible but not forward, and he watched the 3 men work through this information with the expression of people encountering an unexpected obstacle in a plan that had seemed straightforward. He met the eyes of the front man briefly, and let the front man read whatever he needed to read in Jacob's expression, which was calm and alert and entirely unintimidated. After a long, stretched moment, the 3 men left. It was not a resolution. It was a delay. But it was a delay, and delays were useful. Jacob shut the door and turned to Alice, who had maintained the composure through the entirety of the exchange but who now leaned back against the wall beside the door and let out a long, controlled breath. "That was extremely good," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "You were also extremely good." She looked at him with that expression that did something to his ability to maintain his characteristic calm, and then she laughed, briefly and genuinely, a sound he had not heard from her before, bright and real, and he thought without any particular restraint that he wanted to hear it again on a regular basis for a very long time. Roy Garrett came to Dusty Creek on the 3rd day after Eli Boone had ridden for Carson City, arriving at Jacob's boarding house in the late afternoon with the look of a man who has been arguing with himself for longer than he can sustain and has finally, exhaustedly, landed on a decision. Jacob let him in. They sat across from each other in the small room, and Jacob waited, because he had learned that waiting was almost always more productive than speaking first. Roy said, "I should have told you everything from the start." "Yes," Jacob said. "Caldwell had something on me," Roy said. "The money I took from the county years ago." When Judge Merritt found out about it and chose not to press charges, Caldwell found out about that too. He used it. He told me if I helped him, the information stayed buried. If I didn't, it came out, and the judge's decision to cover it up would destroy Merritt's reputation along with mine. He looked at his hands. I told myself that the judge would find a way to stop Caldwell before it got too far, that it was not my responsibility, that I was just the intermediary. Jacob was quiet for a moment, and when the judge was poisoned, he said, Roy's face did something complicated and not entirely pretty. I was already in too deep to pull out. I convinced myself I could fix it by sending you. That you would figure out what was happening and expose it without anyone getting hurt, without my name coming up, without me having to stand in front of anyone and say what I had done. He paused. I am aware that this is not a sufficient account of myself. No, Jacob said. It is not. He let that land for a moment and then said, but I think you already know what the next step is. Roy was quiet. Your testimony, Jacob said, about Caldwell's coercion, about what you know of the land claim scheme, about what you know regarding Judge Merritt's death, is worth more to this case than the documents alone. The documents prove the scheme. Your testimony proves the murder. Without you, Caldwell might face fraud charges and lose his position. With you, he faces murder by proxy and loses his freedom. Roy said nothing for a long time. Alice Merritt will not forgive me, he said. Probably not entirely, Jacob said. But she is a woman who values justice more than she values her own comfort, and she will recognize the value of what you can do. What she thinks of you personally after it is done is something you will have to live with. That is not something I can fix for you. Roy nodded slowly. He sat with it for several minutes in silence. Then he said, set up the meeting. The meeting happened at Alice's house, because it was Alice's house, and because the documents were Alice's documents, and because it was, in every meaningful sense, Alice's case. Jacob had asked her beforehand if she was willing to sit across from the man who had helped destroy her father's life and his reputation in the moment of his death, and she had said, I am willing to sit across from anyone if it means what my father built with the last years of his life amounts to something. Roy Garrett sat in the chair across from Alice Merritt and did not look away from her eyes, which Jacob thought showed a courage of a specific and unglamorous kind. He told her everything. What he had done with the county money, what Caldwell had used it for, what he had known about the judge's investigation and when he had known it, what he had seen and heard regarding the approach to the physician, Dr. Calloway, regarding the judge's medication. He told it without evasion and without self-pity, which Jacob suspected was his way of trying to spend the very last of his credibility on something that mattered. Alice listened. Her hands were in her lap, and Jacob, sitting to the side, watched them, because her hands were where she kept what she was not saying on her face. They tightened once, briefly, when Roy described the mechanism of her father's death. Then they released and went still. When Roy finished, there was a silence of perhaps 30 seconds. I will not thank you, Alice said, because you should have done this 6 months ago and my father might still be alive if you had. But I understand that you are doing it now, and I understand the cost of it, and I will not waste what you are offering by refusing it. She paused. I need you to write it all down and sign it, and I need you to be prepared to say all of it again in front of a territorial court. Yes, Roy said, I know. He wrote his statement at her writing desk, in the house where his silence had contributed to the death of the man who had once protected him. And when he was done, he signed it. And Alice Merritt took the paper with both hands and held it against her chest the way she had held the original documents, with the same guarded intensity. And Jacob thought that no one in this room was entirely unbroken by the weight of what the last hour had contained. After Roy left, the house was quiet in a way that felt different from previous quiet. Jacob was about to say something. He was not sure exactly what. Something about the next practical steps, because practical steps were what he was good at, and because he needed to be good at something right now instead of simply sitting in this particular feeling and letting it have its way with him. But before he could, Alice said, without looking at him, still looking at the statement in her hands, I am glad you came. The simplicity of it was what undid him a little. I am glad I came, he said. She looked at him then, and whatever she saw in his face made her own expression do something he recognized, not because he had seen it there before, but because it matched something in him that he had been carefully not examining for the past week. "This is a complicated moment," she said, with the same precision she brought to everything. "Yes," he said. "We are in the middle of something that has not been resolved yet," she said. "Yes," he said. "And you are the kind of man who moves on when things are resolved," she said, and it was not quite a question, but it was not quite not a question either, and the care behind it, the precise and guarded way she was protecting herself from the answer she was afraid of, made him get up from his chair and cross the small distance between them with a purposefulness that surprised him almost as much as it apparently surprised her. He said. "I am reconsidering my position." She looked up at him. The afternoon light was behind her, catching the dark of her hair and the warmth of her eyes, and the calico cat was asleep on the windowsill, and the fire was burning low, and the statement in her hands was justice for her murdered father. And Jacob Calloway, who had not stayed anywhere in 11 years, thought with perfect, absolute clarity. Here. He kissed her with the careful precision of a man who understands that this is the kind of moment you do not rush, who brings to it the same focused attention he brings to anything that matters, and she kissed him back with the same precision and none of the hesitation he had half expected, because Alice Merritt, he was learning, did not do things by halves once she had decided to do them. When they separated, they were both slightly changed in the way that irreversible things change you. "I should note," she said, slightly breathless, "that I have not kissed anyone since 1879. "That is relevant information," he said. "And that I am not," she said, "the kind of woman who is well served by someone who leaves." "I know," he said. "I am trying to tell you that I do not intend to." "Trying," she noted. "Committing," he revised. The small smile she gave him then was different from any other expression he had seen from her, softer and more private, and he thought he would very much like to spend a considerable amount of time earning more of them. The territorial investigation arrived in Dusty Creek 11 days later, in the form of 2 federal marshals and a representative from the territorial governor's office named Chapman, who was a careful, methodical man with reading glasses and an enormous mustache who was not, Jacob thought with relief, the kind of official who would be easily managed by local money. Commissioner Caldwell was arrested at his office on a Tuesday morning, along with 3 of his associates including the land agent, and, after some consideration, Dr. Holloway, who had administered the compound that had slowly ended Judge Merritt's life over the course of 2 months in the spring of 1882. Roy Garrett turned himself in at the federal marshal's office at 8 in the morning on the same Tuesday, before anyone came for him, which was the kind of thing that did not erase what he had done but did, as Jacob had told him, count for something. The investigation would take months to fully conclude. Cases of this complexity always did. But the key elements were secured, the evidence was in federal hands, and the fraudulent land claims that had stripped 16 families of their property over the preceding 3 years were formally suspended pending review, which meant that those families, some of whom had already given up and moved on, had at least the legal possibility of recovering what had been taken from them. It was not a clean resolution, because these things never were, and Alice knew that better than anyone. But standing on the steps of the marshal's office on that Tuesday afternoon, watching the formal proceedings with the expression of someone who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has just been permitted to set it down, she looked to Jacob like a woman who had done what she set out to do. He stood beside her. Their hands, in the interval between the formal observation and the walk back to Sycamore Lane, found each other without any particular decision on either side. Over the weeks that followed, while the investigation ground forward and the formal legal machinery did its slow, essential work, Jacob Calloway did something he had not done in 11 years. He stopped making plans to leave. It was not dramatic. It happened in the small, accumulative way that real changes happen, through a dozen unremarkable mornings at the house on Sycamore Lane and a dozen evenings where the conversation went until the fire burned down, and neither of them suggested ending it. Through the gradual integration of his presence into the rhythms of her life and her presence into the rhythms of his. Through the discovery that she made terrible coffee but extraordinary bread, and that she had an unexpected appreciation for card games played competitively and seriously, and that she laughed at the things he said that he was most uncertain about saying out loud, and that she trusted him with the thoughts she kept under the composed surface, the anger about her father, the grief she had not had time to fully feel while she was being practical and strategic, the occasional admission of the fear that had been running beneath all of it, through the discovery, on his side, that he was able to talk about Laramie, fully, in pieces, over several evenings, not because he had decided to unburden himself, but because it came up organically, and she listened without performing sympathy and said, when he had finished the worst of it, "You were 23, and you made a decision that had consequences you had not adequately prepared for. That is not something that requires 11 years of penance. It requires, perhaps, that you be less reckless in the future, which you appear to have managed." It was the most useful thing anyone had ever said to him about it. He started asking around about what kinds of work a man with his particular background could do legitimately in Dusty Creek and its surrounding territory, and found that the investigation and its aftermath had created a genuine demand for someone who could locate missing settlers, recover fraudulently filed documents, and navigate the complicated aftermath of the land claim scheme in a way that did not require legal training, but did require the combination of persistence, psychology, and calm negotiation that Jacob had spent 11 years developing. He had a conversation with Alice about it, because having conversations with Alice about things he was thinking about had become, without his entirely noticing when it happened, a natural and necessary part of how he processed anything important. She said, "You should do it. You are very good at it, and if you are going to be here, you should be here with something to do." "If I am going to be here," he said. She looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze that he had first encountered on her porch 2 months earlier. "Are you going to be here?" she asked. He had been thinking about this particular conversation for 3 weeks. He had thought about all the ways to approach it, all the appropriate pacing and caveats and qualifications, all the ways to be appropriately honest about the complexity of his situation and the honesty of his intentions and the various practical considerations. What he actually said was, "Alice, I would like to ask you to marry me. I understand that is not the conventional order of things given that we have known each other for approximately 2 months, and I am entirely prepared to wait as long as you need before you give me any answer, and I will not hold you to anything you say before you have had time to think about it properly. But I want you to know what I am here for because you deserve to know, and because you told me on the first day that we should be honest with each other, and this is the honest thing." Alice Merritt looked at him for a long moment with an expression that did everything at once, that was calculating and moved and amused and warm and exactly itself, unmixed with anything false. "Yes," she said. "I said you should take time to think about it," he said. "I have been thinking about it for approximately 6 weeks," she said. "I am not impulsive. Yes." They were married on a Saturday in December of 1882 in the small church at the center of Dusty Creek with Mrs. Dupree standing as witness and Tom Wicker taking a photograph that came out beautifully, the two of them on the church steps in the winter light, Alice in her best dress with a small bunch of dried wildflowers that someone had pressed and preserved, Jacob in a clean coat that he had purchased specifically for the occasion at the general store. The calico cat sat on the fence post at the edge of the churchyard and watched the proceedings with aristocratic indifference. The winter in Dusty Creek was cold and bright, with clear skies and occasional heavy snowfalls that turned Sycamore Lane into something that looked like the illustrations in the nature books Alice kept on the highest shelf of the lending library. Jacob had taken up residence in the house officially as of the wedding, which involved the practical disruption of two people learning the precise geography of sharing a space after years of solitary living. The negotiations over where things went, and whose habits yielded to whose, all of it conducted with the same combination of honesty and humor that had characterized everything between them. He built a second bookshelf when the existing ones filled past capacity, because the lending library was expanding, and Alice had a theory about how the books should be organized that required more surface area than was currently available. He was not, he admitted, a skilled carpenter, and the shelf listed approximately 4 degrees to the left, which Alice said was adding character to the room. He wrote out 3 mornings a week on the work that was growing into a genuine practice, helping the families whose land claims had been frozen to navigate the documentation process, tracking down one family that had given up and moved 40 miles east, who had a legal right to their land restored, and did not know it yet, working as an informal liaison between the scattered settlers of the valley and the federal investigation's continuing process. He came home in the evenings to the house on Sycamore Lane, to the fire and the tea and the conversation that went until they were both too tired to sustain it. And every single time he came through the door he was struck, not by the routine of it but by the specific, continuous gift of it, by the fact that she was there, that this was where he lived, that the thing he had been unable to believe was permanent for 11 years had apparently become permanently actual in the space of 2 months. In February, Alice told him she was expecting a child. It was a morning in early February, gray and cold, with a light snow coming down outside the window of the kitchen where Jacob was making coffee, which he made considerably better than she did, and which had accordingly become his jurisdiction. She came downstairs and said, with the particular quality of composure that he now recognized as her version of excitement, the composed surface over something large and warm, "I believe we are going to need to make certain additional preparations for the spring." He looked at her, she told him. He set down the coffee pot with the kind of careful precision a man uses when his hands have suddenly become slightly unreliable, and then he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her and held on with his face pressed into her hair, and did not say anything for a full minute because he was not, at that particular moment, capable of speech that would adequately represent what was happening in his chest. She held on just as tightly. "You are all right," he managed eventually. "I am very well," she said into his shoulder. "I am in fact extraordinary." "Yes," he said, "you absolutely are." The investigation of Commissioner Caldwell and his associates concluded formally in April of 1883, with convictions on fraud and conspiracy charges. The case for murder by proxy and the death of Judge Merritt was harder to prosecute than Jacob had hoped, given the nature of the evidence. But the physician Dr. Holloway, faced with the full weight of the federal charges, negotiated a lesser plea and provided testimony that resulted in Caldwell additionally being charged with procurement of murder, a charge that carried a sentence that would keep him imprisoned for the remainder of his useful years. Roy Garrett received a reduced sentence in recognition of his cooperation, 3 years in the territorial prison, which was not nothing but was also not the full weight of everything he had done. Jacob told Alice about the sentence when it was handed down, and she received it with the same measured, practical justice she brought to everything. "It is not what my father deserved," she said. "But it is what the evidence supports, and it is better than nothing, and I am not going to spend the rest of my life being angry about the gap between what should have happened and what did, because that is a gap that never fully closes." She paused. "My father would have said the same thing." The 16 land claims that had been fraudulently filed were reversed or restored over the course of the spring and summer of 1883, a process that involved an enormous amount of documentation and persistence, and the kind of grinding, unglamorous legal follow-through that no one found particularly exciting, but that actually mattered to actual people. Jacob was involved in a significant portion of it, And there were days when the work was tedious and days when a family received news that their land was theirs again. And the weight of that moment made every tedious day preceding it worth the effort. In June, Eli Boone turned 18, and Jacob, who had maintained a quiet respect for the young man's ride to Carson City that had been one of the pivots of the whole situation, offered him part-time work as a writer for the investigative practice, which was now a legitimate and registered operation. Eli accepted with enthusiasm and proved, over the following months, to be exactly as reliable and fast and honest as Alice had said he was. The summer of 1883 was warm and dry, and the lending library on Sycamore Lane expanded by 37 volumes. Alice organized a monthly reading discussion for the women of the town, which quickly became the most intellectually vigorous regular gathering in Dusty Creek, and which Jacob was occasionally allowed to attend as a kind of honorary associate member when he had read the relevant book. He had not read widely before Alice, but he was reading now, making his way through her shelves with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. And he was discovering, an extraordinary person to discuss books with because she never assumed he would agree with her and was always interested in why he did not. Their son was born on an August evening when the heat had broken, and the air coming through the open bedroom window smelled of dry grass and distant rain. It was a difficult birth, not dangerous but long and hard, and Jacob spent several hours in the state of helpless, focused attention that he had once directed at professional problems, but which, directed at his wife's pain and his own inability to do anything about it, was the most demanding thing he had ever experienced. When the doctor finally said it was done and Jacob was allowed back in, Alice was exhausted and luminous and holding a small, extraordinary person against her chest with the same bilateral grip she used for things she was determined not to let go of. "We need to name him," she said. "You choose," Jacob said. He was sitting on the edge of the bed and his voice was not entirely steady and he did not particularly care. "Thomas," she said. "After my father. His middle name was Thomas." "Thomas Calloway," Jacob said. He tried it again. "Thomas Calloway." "Yes," Alice said, "that is his name." Jacob looked at his son for a long time, and then he looked at his wife, and the inadequacy of anything he could say to represent what he was feeling was so complete and so total that he gave up on saying anything and simply took her hand and held it. She squeezed back. Outside, the rain that had been threatening arrived, falling soft and steady on the late summer street, and the calico cat, who had been watching the house from the garden fence all afternoon, with the quiet certainty of an animal who knows something important is happening, finally descended and went in through the kitchen door, which Alice had long ago stopped attempting to keep closed. The autumn of 1883 carried the investigation's final threads to their conclusions and Jacob's practice into something that was generating regular income and a modest but growing reputation throughout the valley. He took on 2 cases that autumn, one involving a missing family member and one involving a contract dispute between a rancher and a water rights holder, both of which resolved successfully, and both of which added to the credibility that was becoming the foundation of something he had not previously possessed, a professional life with roots, with reputation, with the kind of ongoing relationship to a community that required you to be the same person tomorrow as you were today. The missing family member case brought him to a camp of Paiute people north of the valley, where a young woman who had run away from a difficult situation 2 years prior had been living and had chosen to stay. And the resolution of that case involved understanding that not all missing people want to be found, and that the ethical path was sometimes not the obvious one. He told Alice about it in considerable detail that evening, because she was, as always, the person whose thinking helped him clarify his own, and she said, "You did the right thing. The question was never where she was. It was whether she was safe and whether the choice to stay was genuinely hers. You established both." In the winter, Thomas learned to smile, which was an event that Jacob treated with the gravity of a significant natural phenomenon. He wrote a letter to no one in particular, or rather to the general idea of the universe, which was something he had never done before, in which he described the smile in approximately 300 words, and then read it back to himself and put it in the box where Alice kept important documents, because it seemed like something that should be preserved. Alice found it 2 weeks later and read it and said nothing to him about it, but he found it afterward filed between 2 pages of a book on the lending library shelf, carefully positioned as a bookmark, and understood that she was keeping it in the way she kept the things that mattered most, not locked away but integrated into the daily life of the house, available, ongoing, present. By the spring of 1884, the lending library had outgrown the front room, and the two of them made the decision to build an addition onto the house, a proper library room with floor-to-ceiling shelving, and a reading table and good windows for light, funded partly by Jacob's practice and partly by a small grant from the new town council, which had been reorganized after the investigation and included 2 of the formerly displaced settlers among its members. The building of the addition was a community project, which was not planned but happened organically, with Tom Wicker contributing his considerable and underappreciated carpentry skill, and Mrs. Dupree organizing the meals for the work days and Eli Boone doing the heavy lifting, with the cheerful inexhaustibility of an 18-year-old, who is proud of his contribution to something that matters. Jacob did the structural planning, and Alice directed the shelving layout with a specificity that made it extremely clear that the books were the point of the entire exercise, and everything else was in service of them. The library room opened on a June afternoon, and Alice stood in the middle of it surrounded by books and light with Thomas on her hip, and the look on her face was not a performance of happiness but the real thing, settled and fully itself. And Jacob, standing in the doorway watching her, thought about the drifter he had been 11 years ago in Laramie and the succession of faces and towns that had composed the decade between that man and this one, and felt no nostalgia for any of it. He thought about the letter he had sent from Reno, one practical communication to a stranger in a town he had never visited, and the letter already waiting for him when he arrived, pressed flat on the bar with his name written in that precise, unhurried hand. He thought about how she had known he was coming, about the thread across the door and the ink on her finger and the 2 cups of tea already prepared, about Roy Garrett's note and Eli Boone riding for Carson City in a cloud of dust, about her voice saying yes before he had finished qualifying the question. He thought about a lot of things. Then Alice looked over and found him in the doorway, and the expression she gave him was the private one, the softer, less guarded version that was only ever for him, and he stopped thinking about all of it and simply crossed the room. The summer of 1884 was gentler than the one before it. Jacob's practice had expanded enough that he had hired a part-time secretary, a methodical young man named Andrew Clark, who had come to Dusty Creek looking for work after the mining operation 2 valleys over had scaled back, and who proved extraordinarily useful for the documentation work that Jacob found most tedious. Eli Boone had taken on enough responsibility that he was effectively Jacob's field partner rather than simply a writer, and the 2 of them worked well together in the way that people work well together when one person's particular strengths complement the other's particular gaps. The land claim restorations were nearly complete by midsummer. The last of the 16 families to receive formal confirmation of restored rights was a couple in their 60s, Jonas and Mary Whitfield, who had sold most of their furniture and their livestock and moved to a boarding house in the nearest larger town when their claim had been frozen, and who were now moving back to a house that had sat empty for 2 years. Jacob helped them with the moving, which was not strictly within the scope of his professional work, but which felt important and appropriate in a way that he had stopped arguing with himself about. Mary Whitfield, who had the kind of permanent, load-bearing dignity that comes from a life of difficulty navigated with integrity, shook his hand at the door of her restored house and said, "You tell your wife she raised a good man." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "She would be pleased to hear it," he said, "though I should mention she did not raise me. She arrived when the work was mostly done and finished the job." Mary Whitfield laughed and said, "Same thing, son, same thing." He thought about that on the ride home, the September late afternoon making long shadows across the valley, the hills above Dusty Creek beginning their shift from summer brown to autumn gold. He thought about what it meant to be finished by someone, to have the last missing piece of yourself identified and placed by a person who was paying the kind of attention that made that possible. He thought about Alice at her writing desk and Alice in the garden, and Alice in the library she had built inside her dead father's house, making something living out of something broken. He rode home a little faster than usual. Dusty Creek's population had grown by the autumn of 1884, as it always does when a town becomes known as one where the law holds and the land claims are respected, and the general atmosphere is one of human possibility rather than human exploitation. There was a new schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Patterson who was fresh from a normal school in Ohio, and who took an immediate and fierce interest in the lending library as a resource for her students. Alice and Miss Patterson became friends with the straightforward efficiency of two intelligent women who recognize in each other the specific quality of person they have been looking for in a particular place and not finding. Alice began organizing a small collection of books specifically for children, drawing on donations from lending library patrons and on orders placed through the general store's catalog. And the children's collection opened in November with a reading session that attracted 14 children and their parents and the calico cat, who settled in the corner and was identified by 3 separate children as a library cat, and thereafter treated as an institution. Thomas, at 14 months, was a person of considerable and specific character, with Alice's eyes and Jacob's determined, observational way of looking at things, and a communication style that involved a combination of sounds and pointing and expressions of great intensity that made his intentions remarkably clear to the people who had learned to read him. He was specifically and enormously fond of the calico cat, whom he called, in the phonetic approximation available to him, something that sounded like marmot, which was not the cat's actual name, and which the cat seemed entirely uninterested in correcting. In December, on the 2nd anniversary of their wedding, Jacob gave Alice a journal leather-bound, with her initials embossed on the cover. It was not a grand gift, but it was a considered one, because she was someone who organized her thinking by writing and who went through a great deal of paper in the ordinary course of things. And this was better paper in a better container, which seemed like a metaphor he was willing to stand behind. She gave him, in return, the letter she had written before he arrived. His original letter, the one he had sent from Reno, was folded inside it as if they belonged together. She had apparently kept both, all this time, in the locked box under the writing desk alongside her father's documents and the signed statement that had ended Caldwell's scheme. He held them in his hands for a long moment, the 2 pieces of paper that had been the beginning of everything. "I read your original letter again recently," she said. "It is very professional, very correct, very careful." "I was being professional and correct and careful," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what made it interesting. You were trying very hard to communicate exactly what you meant without giving anything away, and what came through anyway was someone genuinely decent trying to do the right thing." She paused. "I wrote back immediately because I was, against my better judgment, curious about you." "Against your better judgment," he said. "I had very good reasons to be cautious about strangers with uncertain motives," she said. "I overrode my caution on the basis of a single letter. Fortunately, it turned out well." "Fortunately," he said, and kissed her with the same precision and none of the uncertainty of the first time, because some things do not get less with repetition but only more themselves, more certain, more specific, more entirely what they are. The year of 1885 came in cold and clear, and found the household on Sycamore Lane in full, established life. The lending library thriving, Jacob's practice settled and useful, Thomas walking, and then running with the sudden terrifying mobility of a toddler who has discovered that the world is considerably larger than previously apparent. The calico cat, whose actual name turned out to be Harriet, a fact that Alice had known all along and that Jacob had never thought to ask about, navigated the household's new topography of small running feet with aristocratic patience. In the spring, Alice told Jacob she was expecting again, with the same quality of composed excitement, the same warm certainty under the practical surface. This time he did not set down the coffee pot with unreliable hands. He simply turned around and smiled at her with the full, unmanaged openness that he had been slowly learning was safe and correct and good to give to the world, or at least to her, and said, "Good," she laughed. "Good," she said. "Wonderful," he revised. "Extraordinary, everything." "Better," she said. The second child was a daughter, born in November of 1885, on a quiet Sunday morning with considerably less drama than Thomas's arrival, as if she had noted the report and decided to be efficient about it. They named her Eleanor, after Alice's grandmother, who had been, according to everything Alice had told him, a woman of remarkable practical wisdom who had once outwitted a fraudulent land agent in entirely different circumstances and had never been thanked adequately for it. Eleanor Calloway, from her first weeks of life, had the kind of concentrated observational stillness that made visitors to the house comment on how remarkably alert she was, and that made Jacob think, privately, that she was very specifically her mother's daughter. Thomas regarded his sister with the complicated mix of territorial concern and involuntary affection that older children bring to the arrival of younger ones, and which resolved itself, over weeks, into a fairly comprehensive protectiveness that was entirely his own idea, and that no one had suggested or modeled for him. By the end of 1885, the investigation and its aftermath were fully concluded. All 16 land claims restored. All principal convictions finalized. Dr. Holloway, who had been the most willing to cooperate, had completed his original sentence and left the territory. Caldwell remained in prison, where Jacob expected he would remain for a considerable number of years. Roy Garrett had completed his sentence in the summer of 1885, and there had been a letter from him, brief and careful, addressed to both of them that said only, "I am going east. I do not expect anything. I hope you are well. Both of you, all of you, I am sorry." Alice had read it twice and then set it down and said, "I believe that is genuine." "I believe it is," Jacob said. "I will not write back," she said. "But I am glad he is not, as I once feared, someone who would spend the rest of his life in the same choices." "No," Jacob said. "He is not." In the spring of 1886, Jacob rode out to the Whitfield farm on an errand that had nothing to do with professional business, just to check in, as he had made a habit of doing every few months since Mary Whitfield had said what she said to him at her door that September afternoon. The farm was showing signs of being actively worked again, the fields turned and planted, the fence lines repaired. Jonas Whitfield was in reasonable health. Mary Whitfield made him tea and said his wife was a rare person. "She is," Jacob said. "And you are happy," she said. It was not a question. He considered the word. He had used it rarely in his life, not because he avoided the feeling but because he had been suspicious of applying too firm a label to something that might shift. But looking at Mary Whitfield across her kitchen table with the spring light coming through the window and the memory of Sycamore Lane in his chest like something warm and permanent, he found that the word was exactly accurate and required no qualification. "Yes," he said, "I am very happy." The town of Dusty Creek by 1886 was a different place from the one Jacob had ridden into on an October afternoon in 1882, and the difference was not only the resolution of Caldwell's scheme, although that had changed things materially and permanently. It was also the slower, less dramatic difference that comes from a community that has looked at itself clearly and chosen, in the main, to do better. Not perfectly, not without ongoing struggle and occasional failure, but with a direction, and with enough people committed to that direction that it had momentum. The lending library was, in its modest way, part of that. Alice had expanded the collection to nearly 400 volumes by 1886, and the children's section had become a genuine resource for the school, and the monthly discussions had started attracting people from outside town, settlers from further in the valley who made the trip specifically for the community and the books and the general atmosphere of a place where ideas were treated as worth having. Jacob's practice had helped restore enough of the displaced families' claims that several of them had been able to rebuild what they had lost. Not entirely, not without scars, but substantially, and the families who had been helped had, in many cases, become part of the broader community in ways that enriched it. Eli Boone, 21 years old in 1886, and possessed of the kind of quiet, capable confidence that comes from several years of doing genuinely useful work well, had taken on a formal partnership role in the practice that made the business what Jacob privately admitted he could not have managed alone. There was, Jacob had observed with considerable affection, a developing situation between Eli and Tom Wicker's younger sister, a sharp and funny young woman named Clara, and he had mentioned it to Alice, who had said she had noticed it 6 weeks earlier and was waiting to see what Eli would do about it. What Eli did about it, eventually, was ask, and the answer was yes, and Dusty Creek celebrated another wedding in the autumn of 1886. Thomas Calloway, at 4 years old, attended the wedding with the gravity and attention of a person who was clearly filing everything away for future reference, and Alina, at nearly a year, slept through most of it in Alice's arms with the same compact efficiency she brought to everything. At the reception, which was held in the expanded dining room of Mrs. Dupree's restaurant, because Mrs. Dupree had insisted, and no one who cared about eating had argued, Jacob danced with Alice in the particular careful, slightly improvised way of two people who did not have extensive dance training, but had enough rhythm between them to make it work. She had her hair down, which was not its usual state, and she was laughing at something he had said, and the lamplight was warm, and the music was a fiddle and a small guitar, and the room was full of people who were genuinely glad to be there, and Jacob thought, "This is what I sent a letter into the unknown to find without knowing I was looking for it." He told her that. She said, "You sent a professional letter about a practical problem." "Yes," he said, "and found all of this." "You found a conspiracy and a murder investigation and a considerable amount of trouble," she said. "I found you," he said. She looked at him in the lamplight with those layered, complex eyes that still managed, 3.5 years in, to be doing several things at once, and what they were doing now was being happy, being fully and actually happy in the specific and irreplaceable way of someone who knows what happiness costs and what it is worth. "You found me," she agreed. In the years that followed, because this story does not end at a wedding or a first year or a recovered land claim, but extends forward into the full texture of a life built in one place by two people who chose it together, the household on Sycamore Lane continued to be what it had been becoming since that October afternoon in 1882, a place of books and conversation and children, and the ongoing, active, serious work of knowing another person well. Thomas went to school and showed a fierce aptitude for mathematics and a corresponding indifference to spelling, which Alice worked on with him at the kitchen table with the patient, relentless application of a woman who understands that skills are developed and not discovered. Alina showed, by the age of 3, an interest in the lending library that went beyond general small-child curiosity into something specific and proprietary, and could be found most mornings sitting on the floor of the library room with a book open in her lap, whether or not she could yet read its contents. A third child arrived in 1888, a boy they named Henry, who was from his first weeks the loudest person in the house, and who seemed to regard this as a feature rather than a problem. Henry's particular genius was for social connection, for knowing instinctively how to make people comfortable, and it expressed itself in an almost mechanical friendliness that made strangers in the general store stop and respond to a 3-year-old's commentary on the weather with the surprised warmth of people who have been seen. Jacob's practice, by 1888, had officially expanded into something that required the word firm rather than practice, with Eli as a full partner and 2 additional employees and a proper office on 2nd Street, 2 doors down from Tom Wicker's photography studio. The work had shifted over the years from the direct aftermath of the Caldwell investigation into a broader range of civil matters, property disputes, missing persons, contracts, and the ongoing, unglamorous work of helping people navigate systems that were designed for people with more resources than most settlers actually possessed. It was good work. Jacob had spent 11 years being very good at something that was occasionally useful and never permanent. He was now being very good at something that was both useful and permanent, that added to the specific place in the world where he lived rather than moving through it without changing it. And the difference was the difference between 2 entirely different lives. He thought about this sometimes on the ride home from the office in the evenings, with the valley laid out around him and the hills to the north, and the particular quality of Nevada light in the late afternoon that turned everything briefly gold before the dark came. He thought about the boy he had been in Laramie, frightened and consequential and unable to stay with what he had done. He thought about the decade of faces and towns that had followed. He thought about the letter he had sent. He thought about the letter already waiting. He thought about that every time still, with the same quality of wonder, the way you hold on to a thing that was the first evidence of something you could not yet name or trust. She had known he was coming. She had made the tea. She had written his name in that precise, unhurried hand and sealed it with amber wax and left it on the bar of a saloon in a town he had never visited. He had arrived to find her already waiting. In 1889, Dusty Creek was incorporated as a proper Nevada town, with a mayor and a formal town council, and a charter that included, at Alice's suggestion, and with the support of enough council members to make it stick, an explicit protection of public library access as a community right. It was the first such provision in any town charter in the territory, and it attracted a brief notice in the Nevada State Journal, which Alice read aloud at breakfast, while Jacob made coffee and Thomas, now 7, listened with the focused attention of a child who has been told this is important and has decided to believe it. The article described the Dusty Creek Lending Library as one of the finest small libraries in the territory, which was probably an overstatement but was not entirely ungrounded, and described its founder as Mrs. Alice Calloway, formerly Merritt, daughter of the late Judge Merritt, whose work in establishing the library has made a lasting contribution to this community. Alice set down the paper. "The article says nothing about the actual content of the library," she said. "Only that it exists and that I founded it. It is a newspaper," Jacob said. "It reports the shape of things." "The shape is not the thing," she said. "No," he said. "But the thing is real regardless of whether the newspaper gets it right, and the people who use the library every week know the thing, not the shape." She considered this. "You are consistently reasonable," she said. "It is occasionally annoying." "I apologize," he said. She picked up the paper again, read another paragraph, and then looked up with an expression that he had a very precise name for by now. "It does say finest small library in the territory," she said. "It does," he said. "That is not nothing," she said. "It is not nothing," he agreed. The October of 1890 came around again. 8 years from the October he had ridden into Dusty Creek with trail dust on his shoulders, and a name written in amber-sealed ink waiting for him on a bar. The air had the same quality, that particular Nevada autumn sharpness that carried pine, resin from the hills, and the smell of dry grass and the promise of cold. The days were shortening, and the cottonwoods along the creek that gave the town its name had gone yellow. Jacob rode home in the late afternoon with a small parcel from the general store that he had been asked, specifically, to acquire. Because the household was out of flour and Thomas had been promised biscuits, and the logistics of biscuit provision had devolved, in the current week's busyness, to whoever was nearest the general store at the relevant time. He came through the gate on Sycamore Lane, and the house was lit from inside, warm light in the library windows and the kitchen window, and through the kitchen window he could see movement, Alice's shape in the lamplight, the suggestion of children at the table, the general orchestrated chaos of dinner being made with 3 children in the house. He stood at the gate for a moment with the parcel in his hands and just looked at the lit house in the blue autumn evening. 8 years. 400 miles from nowhere he had ever been. 1 letter sent into the dark and 1 letter found waiting when he arrived. Everything since. He went in through the gate, up the porch steps, and opened the door, and the house came up around him all at once. The warmth and the noise and the smell of dinner and children and books and the specific, irreplaceable smell of this particular life. And Alice turned from the stove and looked at him with the same eyes that had assessed and calculated, and then, over time, opened, and which now looked at him with the easy, full, undefended warmth of someone who is completely at home in the company they are in. "You got the flour," she said. "I got the flour," he said. Thomas looked up from the table where he was doing his mathematics. Alina was in the library room. He could hear the characteristic stillness of a child absorbed in reading. Henry was somewhere in the back of the house producing, based on the auditory evidence, a running narrative of something involving horses. Jacob set down the parcel and crossed the kitchen and kissed his wife with the full, settled certainty of a man who is exactly where he belongs, in the place where he will always come back to, in the house where the tea is always already made, and his name is written in a precise, unhurried hand as if it were always inevitable. She kissed him back, unhurried, warm here. Outside, the Nevada evening settled over Dusty Creek, and the October stars came out one by one above the hills, and the cottonwoods along the creek rustled and went still, and the life that had started with a single letter continued forward into all of its ordinary, irreplaceable days.